Most people think the medieval flail was a simple chain and spiked ball that could smash through anything. That image is everywhere in movies and games, but it's not the full story, and in some ways, it's flat out wrong. In this video, we're breaking down what real medieval flails actually looked like, who used them, what they were good at, and why this weapon became one of the most misunderstood in medieval warfare. Number 1. The iconic chain ball. The weapon most people picture is a short handle, a chain, and a heavy spiked ball that swings like a wrecking ball. It looks simple, brutal, and almost unbeatable, so movies and games love it. The problem is that this classic flail is a mashup of different medieval ideas, later artwork, and modern imagination. In real medieval Europe, soldiers did use flexible weapons, but the chain and ball version was not a standard knightly sidearm, and it wasn't a magical answer to armor. A big part of the confusion comes from names. People call all kinds of spiky clubs flails, even when there's no flexible link at all. A morning star, for example, is usually a rigid shaft with a spiked head, basically a type of mace. A mace is a solid club designed to hit hard through armor. A flail, strictly speaking, is defined by that flexible connection, a hinge, a strap, or a chain that lets the striking head move independently from the handle. That one design choice changes everything about how the weapon behaves, what it's good at, and why it was never as common as pop culture suggests. The flail also gets wrapped into another popular story. The idea that medieval peasants grabbed farm tools, tied a chain and a spiked ball to a stick, and suddenly had the perfect anti-knight weapon. There is some truth in the farm tool connection, but the details matter, because battlefield weapons tend to become purpose-built very fast when people's lives depend on them. Number 2. What a real flail is.
When historians and museums talk about medieval flails, they're usually talking about a few related forms. One is the footman's flail, a long wooden shaft with a short chain or strap at the end, connecting to a smaller striking piece made of iron or hardwood, sometimes with studs or short spikes. Another is the kiston style, seen in parts of Eastern Europe, a short handle with a flexible link and a compact weight, more like a heavy metal knob than a huge ball. There are also weapons sometimes called chain morning stars, where a spiked head is attached by a chain, but even then the head is typically not cartoonishly large. The flexible section is usually short on purpose. A long chain looks dramatic, but the longer it gets, the harder it is to control, the slower it is to recover, and the easier it is to get tangled up in your own gear. That's why many historical examples and depictions show a link that's just long enough to add some give, not long enough to swing around your body like a lasso. Construction also mattered. A serious military flail needs a solid shaft, a secure attachment point, and a head that won't fly off. Medieval smiths knew how to rivet, weld, and reinforce stress points, but every extra joint is still one more thing that can fail. Some shafts were also strengthened with iron bands or long metal strips to stop the wood from getting chopped up by blades, the same basic idea you see on other pole weapons. If you're equipping an army, reliability counts. So when flails appear in sources, they often show up alongside other infantry weapons that are cheaper and simpler, like spears, bills, and simple axes. It's also worth remembering what medieval soldiers actually carried. Knights didn't wander around with a whole rack of weapons. In battle, they prioritized a primary weapon suited to the situation, plus a backup.
For many periods, that meant a lance on horseback, and then something like a sword, mace, or warhammer on foot, because those are compact, controllable, and work in tight spaces. A flexible weapon is a different kind of choice. Number 3. Why flexibility is a big deal. The flail's flexible link is the entire point, and it's also the reason it's misunderstood. With a rigid weapon, like a mace, the head stays lined up with the handle. You can stop it, redirect it, and use it to block or bind another weapon. With a flail, the head has its own momentum. When you swing, the head accelerates and then lags and whips around, which can make the impact feel heavy. But it also means you can't instantly put on the brakes. If the head misses, it keeps moving. If it hits something at an angle, it can rebound in unpredictable ways. That's not a small downside. It shapes the entire fighting style. It also affects formations. Medieval battles were not just a bunch of one-on-one duels. A lot of fighting happened in close groups, where your weapon has to work with the people next to you. Spears and polearms shine here because they keep distance and stay in line. A flail needs space to swing safely, and that space is a luxury when you're shoulder to shoulder. This is why the flail tends to be described as a specialist's tool, or as something used in certain contexts, rather than the default weapon for everyone. The flexible head can also be awkward on the defense. In theory, the swinging head could make it hard for an opponent to parry cleanly, because even if they meet the shaft, the head might still come around. That's a real advantage in some situations, but it cuts both ways. If you try to parry with a flail, you're managing two moving parts. You can't rely on the head being exactly where you want it in the instant you need it. So a fighter using a flail often has to think more about timing and positioning, and less about quick, tight exchanges.
That makes it harder to teach, harder to drill safely, and less attractive for mass training. Number 4. Flails versus armor. Reality. The biggest myth is that a flail ignores armor, either by smashing straight through plate or by wrapping around shields and helmets as if physics takes a day off. Real armor was built to deal with real impacts. Good plate armor spreads force across curved steel, and it's worn over padding that soaks up shock. Mail, the linked rings people often call chainmail, is excellent against cuts and decent against some blunt force when supported by padding. So, what actually happens when you hit armor with a flail? You can absolutely deliver a nasty blow. Any heavy impact tool can bruise, stun, or break bones, especially if it lands on a less protected area. But the idea that a spiked ball automatically punches through plate is not realistic. Short spikes may help the head bite and keep it from sliding, but spikes don't magically drill through steel. They can also get stuck in a shield face, clothing, or straps, which sounds great until you realize stuck can trap your own weapon for a moment you really can't spare. If you want to reliably defeat armor, medieval fighters tended to use weapons designed for that job. Maces with flanged heads that concentrate force, warhammers with a beak that focuses pressure, and poleaxes that combine an axe blade, hammer face, and top spike for controlled targeting. Those weapons let you place the hit where it matters. A flail's head, because it's on a flexible link, is harder to aim with that kind of precision. That doesn't mean it's useless. It means it fills a narrower role than the legend suggests. The wrap around the shield idea is also half true at best. A flexible weapon can strike at a different angle than a rigid one, and if someone blocks poorly, the head can come around the edge and still make contact.
But in a real fight, a solid shield block usually absorbs the energy and pushes the head away. The flail's head doesn't just keep going around the shield like a cartoon. If it wraps at all, it often loses speed, and it can leave the attacker out of position.
People also imagine flails as disarming tools that tangle swords instantly. Entanglement can happen, but it's not a reliable plan, because both fighters are moving, weapons slide, and you don't get to pause and reel in the opponent. Medieval combat manuals, when they focus on weapon control, usually prefer hooks, binds, and leverage you can count on, not lucky tangles. Number 5. Who actually used them? If you look across medieval Europe, flails are not totally absent, but they're not everywhere either. They show up more on the infantry side of the story than the elite cavalry side. That makes sense. Knights were status warriors with expensive gear and a training culture built around certain weapons. Infantry forces, especially in late medieval warfare, were a mix of professionals, city militias, and regional troops who often used whatever was effective and available. In parts of Central Europe, the flail becomes strongly associated with the Hussite Wars in the early 1400s, where large infantry armies fought with wagons, polearms, crossbows, and early firearms. The Hussite flail image is famous, and it probably draws on the agricultural flail people used for threshing grain, because it already has the basic flexible head concept. But even there, it's important not to picture a random farm tool unchanged. A farm flail is meant to strike bundles of grain, not armored men. A weapon version might be reinforced, shortened, weighted differently, or fitted with iron to survive impacts. Another reason flails show up in art is symbolism. In medieval religious art, certain saints are depicted with tools or weapons linked to their stories, and flail-like implements sometimes appear there.
That can make the weapon seem more common than it was on actual battlefields. There's also the simple fact that unusual weapons get drawn and described more because they're visually distinctive. A spear looks like a spear. It doesn't scream, "Tell a story about me." A weapon with a chain does. Regional variation matters too. In Eastern Europe and the steppe borderlands, flexible weapons like the kiston are often mentioned as part of a wider set of cavalry and infantry arms, influenced by neighboring cultures and styles of fighting. That doesn't mean every soldier carried one, but it does mean the concept wasn't purely fantasy. It just wasn't the universal medieval default that modern media makes it out to be. Number 6. Training, safety, and logistics. One of the most practical reasons the flail stays rare is training time. If you hand a recruit a spear, you can teach basic formation work quickly. Keep the point forward, keep the line, stab on command. If you hand them a billhook or a halberd, you can still teach a useful set of strikes, hooks, and guards without weeks of bruises. A flail asks for more finesse. You need to understand timing so you don't hit your own arm, your own leg, or the person next to you. You also need a grip that can handle shock because the flexible head can yank the handle in ways a rigid weapon doesn't. On top of that, practice is risky. Even with blunt heads, a flexible weapon can slip around guards and hit with surprising speed. That's one reason modern reenactment groups often restrict or ban chain weapons in sparring. They're simply harder to control safely. Medieval commanders had the same problem in a different form. They needed weapons people could train with without constant injuries, and weapons that didn't turn a crowded camp into an accident zone. Carrying the weapon is another quiet issue. A rigid mace can hang from a belt. A spear can be shouldered.
A flail with a dangling head swings, bangs, and catches on things, especially when you're marching, climbing, or moving through tight streets. Logistics matter too. A flail has more parts: shaft, link, head, attachment. Every part needs inspection. Chains can stretch, links can crack, straps can tear, rivets can loosen. In mud, rain, and freezing weather, moving parts suffer. A spear is basically a stick and a head. A mace is one solid piece. A poleaxe is complex, but it's still rigid and built like a tool, with sockets, langettes, and strong joints. If you're buying thousands of weapons, simplicity is a feature. This also helps explain why the chain and ball knight weapon story is so shaky. Knights could afford good gear, but their gear choices were shaped by what worked reliably in close combat and in mixed situations, fighting from horseback, fighting on foot, pushing in crowds, grappling. A long swinging chain is more trouble than it's worth in that environment. Number 7. What the flail was good for. After you strip away the myths, the flail still has real battlefield logic. The flexible head can deliver heavy impact even with a relatively light shaft, because the head can accelerate on the end of the link. That can be useful against shields, against lightly armored opponents, or against helmets and limbs where even good armor has limits. The odd angles are also a real factor. If someone is used to parrying rigid weapons, a flail can change the rhythm because contact with the shaft doesn't always stop the head. That makes the defense feel less certain. Another realistic advantage is psychological. A weapon that looks unpredictable can make people hesitate, especially if they haven't trained against it. Medieval war was full of morale swings, and anything that makes the other side a little less confident can matter. Still, the best way to think about the flail is not as an armor destroyer, but as a situational impact weapon.
It fits best where you have room to swing and where your main problem is shields and unarmored targets, not full plate harness. It also pairs better with certain styles of fighting, like loose infantry skirmishing or fighting around obstacles, rather than tight pike blocks. The popular idea that a flail is mainly for wrapping around shields can be reframed in a more realistic way. It can punish sloppy shield work. If a defender holds the shield too far from the body or turns it at a bad angle, a flexible head might clip around the edge. That's not guaranteed, but it's possible, and it's enough to make disciplined defense important. The same goes for the disarm myth. A flail can snag a weapon if the moment lines up, especially if the link catches on a crossguard or a protruding part. But fighters who rely on it as a main tactic are betting on a low percentage move. Medieval combat, especially between trained people, usually rewards the boring fundamentals: distance, timing, balance, and controlled pressure. Number 8. How the myth took over. The flail's modern reputation comes from a perfect storm of visuals and storytelling. A chain weapon reads instantly on screen. You can understand it in 1 second, even if you know nothing about medieval warfare. It also signals unusual, which is why fantasy art loves giving it to villains, monsters, or dark soldiers. Later centuries also played a role. Renaissance and early modern writers sometimes described medieval warfare through a dramatic lens, and Victorian-era Romanticism turned the Middle Ages into a stage full of exaggerated props. Museums and collectors, especially in the 1800s and early 1900s, sometimes labeled spiked maces as morning stars and flexible weapons as flails in ways that didn't always match medieval terminology. Modern replicas then copied those labels, and the loop kept going. Today, when historians, reenactors, and HEMA researchers look at real evidence, art, documents, surviving pieces, they tend to treat the flail as real but uncommon, and they separate it from the made-up, one-size-fits-all chain and ball image. You end up with two flails, the historical one, usually with a short link and a practical purpose, and the pop culture one built for spectacle. That gap is why so many people are surprised when they learn what medieval soldiers were actually carrying on the battlefield.